Marko Polo. In this session, you'll learn about a man who is perhaps the most famous traveler in history. Through his stories about his travels, he broadened the horizons of the people of medieval Europe, literally expanded the world for them, and inspired countless numbers of explorers during Europe's great age of discovery. His name was Marko Polo. Marko Polo's travels in the late 1200s took him to parts of the world no Westerner had ever seen. He traveled farther than any man before him. He was the very first traveler to cross the entire length of Asia, naming and describing each kingdom he passed through. He was the first to record information on the deserts of Persia, the plains of Afghanistan, the mountains of Pakistan, the rivers of western China, and the Mongolian steppes, home of the fearful Mongolian tribes that threatened to conquer the entire world. In Europe, all these places were unknown at the time. There were no books, no chronicles, no first-hand accounts of the lands in the Far East. Anything the 13th century European knew about these areas was based on distant rumor. When Marko Polo returned from his travels, he wrote a book originally entitled A Description of the World, but known today simply as The Travels of Marko Polo. It is through this book that he documented in detail all he had seen and done. Through this book alone, he opened the eyes of medieval Europe and introduced them to a new, unfamiliar world that before him had been cloaked in secrecy. The book, published in 1299, was a medieval bestseller. It told of Marko Polo's travels from his home in Venice across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia to the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongols, located in an area we now know as Beijing, China. Marko Polo gave Westerners an intimate picture of life in these exotic lands, and a colorful account of Kublai Khan's brilliant court. His record of the famous royal city Xanadu is the only record we have of that city, the ruins of which were not discovered until centuries later. His writings, almost 400 pages of them, are a priceless account of the cultural, political, and social life in the many lands he visited. His vivid and detailed descriptions include dress and costumes, foods, religious beliefs and rituals, marital customs, funeral rites, housing and architecture, monuments and shrines, transportation, trade and commerce, agriculture, plants and animals, geography and topography, government, class structure, and arts and crafts. He also recounted anecdotes, folk tales, legends, and oral histories he'd heard from the people he met. Because he became a trusted friend and emissary of the great Kublai Khan, Marko Polo had access to the court and described Khan himself, his palace, his wives and concubines, his servants, his wealth, and his regal, opulent lifestyle. Through Marko Polo, all of Europe came to know about the endless riches of China, its cultured cities, its vast terrain, its astounding inventions and products. He was the very first to describe paper money, coal, the Great Canal, and hundreds of other things. He was the very first Westerner to describe Tibet, Burma, Indochina, Japan, Java, Sumatra, Ceylon, and India. Like all men who bring what is new and unexpected, Marko Polo was doubted, criticized, even ridiculed during his own time. Many people were mesmerized and inspired by his stories, but many others dismissed them as pure fiction. The provincial 13th century mind found the wonders and marvels Polo described to be unbelievable. Today we can realize the full worth of Marko Polo's travels. We know that what he reported was largely true, although probably sometimes embellished for effect. As the years passed, Marko Polo's writings would be taken more and more seriously. In time, mapmakers used them to help them chart the world. His works would inspire merchants, travelers, and adventurers to pursue their own dreams in the East and elsewhere. Marko Polo would usher in the age of exploration. Among those who found inspiration in his writings was the young Christopher Columbus. 200 years later, he too resolved to see what Marko Polo had seen and to return with the riches he described in his book. Columbus carried Marko Polo's well-worn volume with him for many years, and it was with him as he set out from Spain in the Santa Maria one historic day in 1492. Although his course would lead him to a very different destination, Originally, Columbus was seeking what Marko Polo had found. Marko Polo traveled for 26 years in the Near and Far East, and for 20 of those years he was in the service of Kublai Khan, descendant of the fearsome Genghis Khan. He traveled in the countries and regions we know today as Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Tibet, and China. It was an extraordinary journey for its time, a time when just traveling from city to city in Italy could be a major expedition. Ever since the days of Alexander the Great, the Western world had some knowledge of India, but north and east of India lay parts unknown. Though great quantities of Chinese silk were carried along the caravan trails of Central Asia for sale in the Roman Empire, no one seemed to have any knowledge of the countries from which it had come, nor of the countries it had passed through. Christian merchants took the risk of trading with Muslims whom they considered infidels, but they seldom traveled beyond the seaports of the Mediterranean or the Black Sea. East and West were two different worlds. Marko Polo became a window through which one civilization took its first tentative peek at another. These civilizations were vastly different. On the surface, they had almost nothing in common. The Westerner's view of the East was one of prejudice, ignorance, and superiority. Any civilization that was not European or Christian was backwards and barbarian. The people in the East likewise had little knowledge of the West, but they were interested. Kublai Khan and others were delighted with Marko Polo and loved to hear about life in this strange, distant world to the west. Marko Polo became a living link between two cultures that had never before felt any connection or had any reliable information on each other. He opened the eyes and broadened the horizons of both populations, and he paved the way for trade and commerce between the two lands. This was one of his goals in writing about his travels, for he was careful to map out and describe trade routes and enumerate the valuables that could be found along the way. He focused chiefly on the most profitable of these goods, such as jewels, silks, and spices. Because the journey itself was so expensive and hazardous, only luxury items brought a return on the merchant's investment. But the travels of Marko Polo became far more than a guidebook for the daring and ambitious merchant. He gave the world a priceless piece of history, a one-of-a-kind documentation of life in the Far East during the 13th century. Polo's sense of adventure and passion for travel was inherited. His father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo Polo, were also merchants. In 1254, the two wealthy gentlemen set out from Venice on their first visit to the East and journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan, where they became highly favored. Marko, whose mother had died soon after his birth, was raised by his aunt in a house full of cousins and other relatives. His father, who had been traveling when Marko was born, had never seen his son. By the time Niccolo Polo arrived in China, Marko was 6 years old, and for the next 10 years he would wait anxiously for his father's return. Meanwhile, in China, Marko's father told the Khan about the Christian religion. The Khan was intrigued by this unusual religion practiced in the West, and he sent the Polos back to Italy with his own envoys, whom he hoped would meet with the Pope. His wish was that the Pope would send 100 scholars to his court to prove that the law of Christ, in his words, was most agreeable. If they succeeded at this task, Khan vowed that he and all his subjects would become Christians. This was too good an offer to resist. The Polos sailed back to Italy in 1269, where father and son finally met for the first time. Marko was 15 years old, but to his father's disappointment, the Pope had died and the message from the Khan couldn't be delivered. He decided to wait until a new Pope was selected, but after 3 years, when this still hadn't been accomplished, they decided to make their way back to Kublai Khan's court. This time, they took Marko with them. Before the three could set out on their journey, Pope Gregory was anointed, and so they approached him with Kublai Khan's request. The new pope reluctantly agreed, but instead of 100 scholars, he sent only 2 priests to accompany them. Both priests soon became discouraged with the hardships and privations of the journey and turned back. The 3 explorers, Marko Polo, his father Niccolo Polo, and his uncle Maffeo Polo, forged ahead. We know very little of Marko Polo's life before and after his travels. and there are no detailed descriptions of him as a man. He was born in the year 1254 in Venice, 2 years before the beginning of the famous 100 Years' War between Venice and Genoa. Marko Polo's involvement in this war would later result in his imprisonment, a lucky event as it turned out, because this is where he recorded his travels. Marko Polo's times were the times of St. Thomas Aquinas, of Dante, author of the Divine Comedy, and of the great Persian poets Rumi and Hafiz. It was a period that saw the end of the Crusades, the founding of the Ottoman Empire, and intensification of the Inquisition, including the use of torture. Most importantly to Marko Polo, it was also the age of the Mongol conquerors. In 1206, 48 years before Polo was born, the Mongol tribes gathered at their holy place on the plain of Karakorum and elected a ruler, or Khan. Under his rule, they conquered the northern region of China, known as Cathay, and then decided to conquer the world. Within 2 generations, they succeeded in conquering almost the entire landmass of Eurasia, excluding only India, Arabia, Western Europe, and parts of Indochina. In terms of sheer size, this stupendous empire was unequaled either before or since, and the entire eastern part of it was under the rule of the Khan and his successors. The rest was divided up between 3 lords who were members of the Khan's family. The passage of the Mongol army left devastation and death in its path. To Christians, it seemed the legions of Satan were on the march. Christians referred to the Mongols as Tartars because it reminded them of the word Tartarus, a mythological term for hell. Still, they were not overly upset because the only Christian victims of the Mongols were the Russians, who were rebel followers of the Greek Church. The victims who really suffered under the Mongols were the Muslims, who had long been enemies of the Christians anyway. Kublai Khan was a very different man from his more savage ancestors. He had absorbed something of Chinese culture, including the humanitarian spirit of Buddhism. In many ways, he was as simple and vigorous as a common nomad, but he was also a visionary and a remarkably efficient ruler. It was at this time that Kublai Khan sent the Polos back to Italy to recruit Christian missionaries. A few years later, they set out for the East together, young Marko by their side. What the Polos did during these 20 years is largely unknown. Marko's book doesn't detail all those years and only describes certain events from the period, or general situations. What is obvious is that they enjoyed the freedom of travel throughout the empire, although where they exactly went is still a matter of debate. It's generally believed that they were cut off from all communication with the West, although even this isn't certain. We know Marko became fluent in 4 different languages during his travels, and was a valuable ambassador for the Emperor Kublai Khan. He was sent on different missions throughout China, some diplomatic, some advisory, some for the purposes of gathering information for the emperor. He also traveled on behalf of the Khan to places like Japan, Indochina, southern India, and what he calls the coast and islands of the Indian Sea, including Ethiopia. After 17 years at the court of Khan, the wealthy Polos, surrounded by envious princes, decided that if they ever wanted to return to Venice, they could most easily do so under the protection and safety of the Khan. They resolved to go while the ruler, already an old man, was still alive. They asked his permission to return home, but at first he refused. The emperor enjoyed their company and services too much to let them go. After a time, however, he was persuaded to let them leave. 14 ships were prepared for the voyage home, and during that voyage, 600 crew members were lost in storms. Only a handful survived, among them Marko and his father and uncle. While still en route, they heard news of Kublai Khan's death. Marko Polo said later, "I believe it was God's will that we should return, so that men might know the things that are in the world, since there was never man yet, Christian or Saracen, Tartar or pagan, who explored so much of the world as Messer Marko, son of Messer Niccolo Polo, great and noble citizen of the city of Venice." By the time Marko Polo returned, he'd traveled 15,000 miles. He'd been gone over 24 years. After the Polos' arrival in Venice in 1295, there are almost no accounts of their lives. One story has it that their families and friends failed to recognize them, and that the Polos dramatically tore open their shabby travel garments and let fall a stream of rubies, diamonds, and emeralds. Marko Polo, now 44 years old, decided to join Venice in its war against its longtime foe, Genoa. He was captured while serving as the commander of a Venetian galley and put in prison. During this imprisonment, he entertained fellow prisoners with the stories of his travels. Word of his amazing stories spread throughout Genoa, and important citizens visited him in his cell, just to hear the stories firsthand. As fate would have it, one of Marko Polo's cellmates, a writer and professional storyteller named Rusticello, recognized the potential of these stories. He convinced Marko Polo to send to his father in Venice for his notes on his travels. This was the start of a literary partnership that would open the eyes of all of Europe to a new, unknown part of the world. Marko Polo dictated 4 books, which were later published as one volume. It began with this introduction. Here you will find all the great wonders and curiosities of Greater Armenia and Persia, of the Tartars and of India, and of many other territories. For I would have you know that from the time when our Lord God formed Adam, there has been no man who has known or explored so many various parts of the world and of its great wonders as Marko Polo. For this reason, he made up his mind that it would be a great pity if he did not have a written record made of all the things he had seen and had heard by true report, so that others who have not seen and do not know them may learn them from this book. Polo's claim that he traveled more extensively than any man since the creation may be boastful, but it's possibly also true. There are no other written records of anyone having traveled so far. Marko Polo's records remained the only source of information about the Far East until the late 19th century. In Venice, Marko Polo lived the rest of his life quietly, working as a merchant, marrying, and raising 3 children. He was often teased about his tall stories of the East. People nicknamed him Marko Millions because he told over and over of the wealth and opportunities that lay to the East. It became a common expression to say, "That's a Marko Polo," whenever someone exaggerated or told an obvious lie. Marko Polo died in 1324, 26 years after his return at the age of 70. He left a detailed will in which he freed a Tartar slave he'd apparently brought back from the East. On his deathbed, Polo was pressured to admit he'd made up some of his adventures, but instead he replied, "I have not told the half of it." Although history has left us no descriptions of Marko Polo, we can determine a lot about him just by reading his notes. Obviously, he had great enterprise, resourcefulness, stamina, and, fortunately for history, an amazingly retentive memory. He noticed things with the eyes of a practical merchant and traveler, which is why he so diligently recorded food and water along the routes, means of transport, and the marketable products in every district. He was true to his age in that he classified people mainly on the basis of religion rather than race or culture. They are either Christians, Jews, Saracens, or idolaters. Saracens is a term he used interchangeably with Muslims. He had a special respect for Buddhism and Hinduism, and even compared Buddha to a Christian saint, quite a leap of faith for a man of his time. One of Marko Polo's great contributions was his description of the people he encountered in 13th century Asia. He provided abundant and picturesque details of the Persians, Turks, Tartars, Chinese, Tibetans, and Indians, including all the particulars of their dress, physical features, customs, and mannerisms. When Marko Polo promised to provide his contemporaries with a description of the world, neither he nor they had any idea just how big that world was. Although we know today that the world is far larger than 13th century humankind imagined it, Marko Polo still described a surprisingly large part of that world, from the Polar Sea to Java, from Zanzibar to Japan. He had no rival in the field of travel until 2 generations later, and some of the trails he blazed were not traveled again by a European for 600 years. Still others may have remained unexplored until the opening of the Burma Road in World War II. The task of mapping out Marko Polo's travels in detail has yet to be completed and probably never will, since parts of his journeys were unaccounted for. The parts of the journey that are accounted for make up one of the most stirring and inspiring true-life adventures in the history of the world. The first part of Marko Polo's travels was a 3.5-year journey to Kublai Khan's court. The journey was halted for 1 year when Marko became ill, possibly from malaria. At the start of the journey, the Polos hoped to travel by sea, but when they couldn't find worthy ships, they joined a camel caravan instead and crossed overland. During these years, Marko Polo dutifully reported not only the geography and traveling distances and conditions, but specifics like food preparation and production, trade, religious practices, and customs and oral traditions among the many tribes and civilizations he encountered. He passed through the area we now know as Turkey and described what we know today as Mount Ararat. In the heart of Greater Armenia is a very high mountain shaped like a cube, on which Noah's Ark is said to have rested, whence it is called the Mountain of Noah's Ark. It is so broad and long that it takes more than 2 days to go around it. On the summit the snow lies so deep all the year round that no one can ever climb it. This snow never entirely melts, but new snow is forever falling on the old, so that the level rises. But on the lower slopes, thanks to the moisture that flows down from the melting snow, the herbage is so lush and luxuriant that in summer all the beasts from near and far resort here to batten on it, and yet the supply never fails. This flow of moisture also has the effect of making the hillsides very boggy. Marko Polo also reported that the ark was actually visible as a black patch among the snow on the mount, though it could not be seen from a close distance. The natives seldom mention it, he said, but on being questioned they answered, "It is said that the black patch is the ship of the world." Polo continued through the Middle East, providing descriptions of many villages and peoples along the way. He was particularly impressed by Baghdad and said, "In Baghdad, which is a very large city, the Caliph of all the Saracens in the world has his seat, just as the head of all the Christians in the world has his seat in Rome. Through the midst of the city flows a very large river, by which travelers may go to the Indian Sea. By this route merchants come and go with their merchandise. You should know that from Baghdad to the sea is a journey of fully 18 days. Merchants traveling to India follow this river to a city called Kais, where they enter the Indian Sea. On the river between Baghdad and Kais, there is a large city named Basra. In the groves all around Basra grow the best dates in the world. It is in Baghdad that most of the pearls are pierced that are imported from India into Christendom. Here, too, are woven many fabrics of cloth of gold and silk, very richly decorated with beasts and birds. It is a great center for the study of the law and Muhammad, and of necromancy, natural science, astronomy, geomancy, and physiognomy. It is the largest and most splendid city in all these parts." In his description of Baghdad, Polo presented an Arab city that could easily rival the greatest cities of 13th century Europe. He pointed out its cultural, scientific, and commercial achievements, and of course recognized its importance to the merchant, not only through its strategic location, but in the many exquisite wares to be found there. In the 13th century, Baghdad was an important crossroads, and the religious, spiritual center of the Muslim world. Polo traveled on to another important Arab city, Tabriz, which he said was the most splendid city in a province called Iraq. Today, of course, Tabriz is in Iran. His description of Tabriz is notable because it demonstrates his consistent awareness of merchandise and trade, and the promise of lucrative trade is what later inspired many other explorers. "The people of Tabriz live by trade and industry, for cloth of gold and silk is woven here in great quantity and of great value. The city is so favorably situated that it's a market for merchandise from India and Baghdad, from Mosul and Hormuz, and from many other places. And many Latin merchants come here to buy precious stones, which are found here in great abundance. It's a city where good profits are made by traveling merchants. The city is entirely surrounded by attractive orchards, full of excellent fruit." Polo always measured distance in terms of days of travel. A day's ride, or 10 days' ride, or 40 days' ride is the only means for measuring distance he had. But it was also more relevant to the merchants of the time, who rode from place to place and would have little use for notations about miles or kilometers. After several days, Polo reached the Persian Gulf and stopped at a city on the coast called Hormuz. He was mostly concerned about the torrid, hot, and unhealthy climate there, and told a gruesome story to make his point. In summer, the people do not stay in the cities, or they would all die of the heat, but they go out to their gardens, where there are rivers and sheets of water. It is a fact that several times in the summer there comes a wind from the direction of the sandy wastes that lie around this plain, a wind so overpoweringly hot that it would be deadly if it did not happen that, as soon as men are aware of its approach, they plunge neck-deep into the water and so escape its heat. To show just how hot this wind can be, here is an account of something that happened when Messer Polo was in these parts. A king resolved to seize the opportunity when the men of Hormuz were living outside the city in the open. He mustered 1,600 horses and 5,000 foot soldiers and sent them across the plain to make a surprise attack. One day, having failed through faulty guidance to reach the place appointed for the night's halt, they bivouacked in a wood not far from Hormuz. Next morning, when they were on the point of setting out, the hot wind came down on them and stifled them all, so that not one survived to carry back the news to their lord. The men of Hormuz, hearing of this, went out to bury the corpses, so they would not infect the air. When they gripped them by the arms to drag them to the graves, they were so parched by the tremendous heat that the arms came loose from the trunk, so that there was nothing for it but to dig the graves beside the corpses and heave them in. He also reported superstitions, miracles, magic, and occult events and beliefs, such as this story about a great desert he encountered in Turkestan. The truth is, when a man is riding by night through this desert, and something happens to make him loiter and lose touch with his companions, by dropping asleep or for some other reason, and afterwards he wants to rejoin them, then he hears spirits talking in such a way that they seem to be his companions. Sometimes, indeed, they even hail him by name. Often these voices make him stray from the path, so that he never finds it again. And in this way many travelers have been lost and have perished. And sometimes, in the night, they are conscious of a noise like the clatter of a great cavalcade of riders away from the road. And believing that these are some of their own company, they go where they hear the noise, and when day breaks, find they are victims of an illusion, and in an awkward plight. And there are some who, in crossing this desert, have seen a host of men coming towards them, and suspecting that they were robbers, have taken flight. So, having left the beaten track and not knowing how to return to it, they have gone hopelessly astray. Yes, and even by daylight, men hear these spirit voices, and often you fancy you are listening to the strains of many instruments, especially drums and the clash of arms. For this reason, bands of travelers make a point of keeping very close together. Before they go to sleep, they set up a sign pointing in the direction in which they have to travel. And round the necks of all their beasts they fasten little bells, so that by listening to the sound they may prevent them from straying off the path. Polo proceeded on the road to Cathay towards the court of Kublai Khan and recorded his understanding of the historic lineage of Khan. Historians have found many errors in Polo's account of the rise and fall of Mongol rulers, but his descriptions of their customs were a treasury of information previously unknown to the world, and unknown to us today if not for his travels. Here's part of his description of the funeral rituals when one of the Khans has died. You should know that all the great lords who are of the lineage of Khan are conveyed for burial to a great mountain called Altai. When one of them dies, even if it be at a distance of 100 days' journey from this mountain, he must be brought there for burial. And here is a remarkable fact. When a body of a great Khan is being carried to the mountain, be it 40 days' journey or more or less, all those who are encountered along the route by which the body is being conveyed are put to the sword by the attendants who are escorting it. Go, they cry, and serve your Lord in the next world. For they truly believe that all of those whom they put to death must go and serve the Khan in the next world. And they do the same thing with horses. When the Khan dies, they kill all his best horses so that he may have them in the next world. It is a fact that when Mongu Khan died, more than 20,000 men were put to death, having encountered his body on the way to burial. The second phase of his travels centers on Marko Polo's experiences in China and life in the court of Kublai Khan. Polo had extreme admiration for the ruler and never tired of pointing out his attributes. He described him physically as of good stature, neither tall nor short, but of a middle height. He has a becoming amount of flesh and is very shapely in all his limbs. His complexion is white and red, the eyes black and fine, the nose well formed and well set on. He depicted the Khan's palaces, his vast court, his government, and armies. He also gave an account of a battle led by the great Khan himself. He reported that, when all were in battle array, one could hear a sound arise of many instruments of various music, and of the voices of the whole of the two hosts loudly singing, for this is the custom of the Tartars. Polo seemed particularly enthralled by the women of the court, the Khan's wives and concubines. He said, "He has 4 consorts who are all accounted his lawful wives, and his eldest son by any of these 4 has a rightful claim to be emperor on the death of the present Khan. The wives are called empresses, each by her own name. Each of these ladies holds her own court. None of them has less than 300 ladies in waiting, all of great beauty and charm. They have many eunuchs and many other men and women in attendance, so that each one of these ladies has in her court 10,000 persons." Marko Polo also eloquently described court affairs, such as the marking of the calendar and the celebration of thousands of festivals and hunting trips. Record-keeping was very important to the Chinese. Each household kept, near its front door, a list of the names of all the home's inhabitants, and innkeepers were required to record the names of all travelers and the dates of their visits. Perhaps most intriguing to 13th century Europeans, and invaluable to later historians, were Marko Polo's accounts of the marvelous inventions he saw while serving the Khan. These include the use of paper money, a system of express messengers, rather like the Pony Express, and efficient highway systems. Some of the remains of these can still be seen today. Polo was astounded when he discovered an unfamiliar source of fuel, which we know by his description is coal. Let me tell you next of the stones that burn like logs. It is a fact that throughout the province of Cathay there is a sort of black stone which is dug out of veins in the hillsides and burns like logs. These stones keep a fire burning better than wood. I assure you that if you put them on the fire in the evening and see that they are well alight, they will continue to burn all night, so that you will still find them glowing in the morning. They do not give off flames, except a little when they are first kindled, just as charcoal does, and once they have caught fire, they give out great heat. For all the fantastic inventions he stumbled upon, Polo gave credit to Kublai Khan, whom he saw as a great man of wisdom and benevolence. From our modern perspective, it's sometimes delightful to see how the 13th century traveler described and interpreted things which were completely new to him, but which are very familiar to us today. His description of coal is one example. Here's another example, this time a strange new animal he discovered on his way from Beijing to Bengal. In this province live huge serpents of such a size that no one could help being amazed even to hear of them. They are loathsome creatures to behold. Let me tell you just how big they are. You may take it for a fact that there are some of them 10 paces in length, that are as thick as a stout cask, for their girth runs to about 10 palms. These are the biggest. They have 2 squat legs in front near the head, which have no feet, but simply 3 claws, 2 small and 1 bigger, like the claws of a falcon or lion. They have enormous heads and eyes so bulging that they are bigger than loaves. Their mouth is big enough to swallow a man at one gulp. Their teeth are huge. All in all, the monsters are of such inordinate bulk and ferocity that there is neither man nor beast but goes in fear of them. Here the explorer has obviously come across his first crocodile. In China, he also discovered a startling new style for decorating the body. He said, "They take 5 needles joined together, and with these they prick the flesh till the blood comes, and then they rub in a certain black coloring stuff. The markings last forever." Marko had discovered the tattoo. The last phase of Marco Polo's journey was the journey home. As he crossed through China and the Mideast, he saw camel caravans gathered by fountains of oil, hauling off a strange black liquid, which was an amazing source of heat and light. He passed through the city of Mian, with its 2 great towers, one of silver, the other of pure gold. He stayed for a time in the utopian Chinese city of Kinsai, with its 12,000 bridges spanning its rivers and canals, its stone-paved streets, and its hundreds of beautiful carvings. He marveled over the magical Lak province, where people commonly live to the age of 150. He also encountered strange characters and mystical tribes, a miserly ruler unwilling to provide for his kingdom's protection, who was captured and locked in a tower where, surrounded by piles of gold, he starved to death. A diabolical band of robbers which had the power to call down the powers of darkness upon the caravans they attacked. Tribes where fathers took care of newborn babies, while the mother was allowed to move about freely. An ancient drug dealer who used his trance-induced followers to commit murders, and various sorcerers and cannibals. On his way home, Marco Polo also ran into tribes who used gold, silver, pearls, diamonds, and rubies as common barter, and who wore rich silks and embroidery for work and play. He saw asbestos, musk scent, and salt, all used as money. He became acquainted with exotic spices, sugar, strange drugs, and pungent incense. He discovered bizarre animals, including what he thought was a unicorn with, in his own words, hair like that of a water buffalo and feet like those of an elephant, an ugly beast to behold. He was, in fact, describing his first rhinoceros. Polo also provided Europe with its first detailed description of India, where he found the customs and religious beliefs strange but fascinating. He undoubtedly shocked the people back home with his stories like the following. When a man is guilty of a capital offense and the king has decreed his death, the offender declares that he wishes to kill himself out of respect to some particular idol. The king expresses his approval. Then all the offender's kinsfolk and friends take him and set him on a chair and give him fully a dozen swords, and carry him through the city, proclaiming aloud, "This brave man is going to kill himself for love of such and such an idol." In this way they carry him through the whole city. When they have reached the place where justice is done, then the offender takes a knife and cries in a loud voice, "I kill myself for love of such and such an idol." Having spoken these words, he takes 2 swords and thrusts them into his thighs at one stroke. Then he thrusts 2 into his arms, 2 into his belly, 2 into his chest, and so he thrusts them all in, crying aloud at each stroke, "I kill myself for love of such and such an idol." Another custom is this: when a man is dead and his body is being cremated, his wife flings herself into the same fire and lets herself be burnt with her husband. And I assure you that there are many who do as I have told you. Yet these stories of what Christians would consider pagan and barbaric customs are well balanced by Polo's tolerance and even respect for the Indian sense of justice, their great kingdoms and splendid cities, their beautiful products, their yogis and holy men, and their deep faith, even though it's a faith that defied Western understanding. In India, Marco Polo discovered the principle of reincarnation, a principle that fascinated him. From India, Marco Polo traveled through Zanzibar, where he was stunned by the size and strength of the natives. On to Abyssinia, where the citizens branded themselves with hot irons, and back into Turkestan, where he wrote accounts of the Tartar wars. From there, it was home to Venice, after an absence of over 20 years. Marco Polo's extensive and daring adventures didn't bring him great wealth. They didn't bring him great eminence or a position of power at home, although his book did bring him popular fame. What those travels did bring him was a unique and priceless role in history, for he became the communicator and the enlightener, who was able to make two vastly different civilizations aware of each other. He increased their mutual understanding and interest. He inspired further trade and travel that eventually formed a solid link between East and West. And he launched the age of exploration. The path these future travelers and merchants would follow were first blazed by Marko Polo himself. But they are only the geographical paths. The path that connected the Western mind and the Eastern mind, and that led brave men and women into new, uncharted territories, was his greatest achievement of all.
This is the end of the session.